am very excited to welcome back our speaker this evening, Dr. Bruce Lyon. Bruce is a professor of evolutionary ecology at UC Santa Cruz. His research focuses on the evolution of reproductive strategies and mating behavior of birds, which he has covered in previous talks with us. This includes his long-term research on the adaptive basis of brood parasitism in American coots, which has sought to understand why parasitism within species evolves and how the behavior influences other aspects of social behavior. His talk on brood parasitism in black-headed ducks has actually been our most viewed presentation as far as the recording goes. And another project that he works on is regarding golden-crowned sparrows. So for over 20 years, he has been studying the winter social lives of these birds, particularly the ones that spend their winters at the Arboretum at UC Santa Cruz. So you can check out all of those talks on our YouTube channel and website, and we're very excited to hear this one. It's a little bit of a different location for sure, but I'm very excited to hear more about the birds of Australia. So Bruce, I will hand things over to you.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I have never studied Australian birds, but I hope to someday. But they're some of my fondest birds, and so I prepared a similar talk to this for the UCSC Arboretum a few years ago, and I just like giving it because they're among my favorite birds. And so, just to outline in terms of what we'll be doing tonight, covering is a little bit of background about the ecology, biogeography, and taxonomy of Australian birds. That's basically how, over the history of the Earth, did they come to be so weird and distinct. And then I'll do sort of three major chunks about particularly either important groups or one place. So I want to talk about one nectar-eating group, the honey eaters, just because they're a personal favorite. And then Australia is awash in parrots. And so that's something, if you go to Australia, it is a bit like going to Mars, and part of that is just because of the different birds there. And so parrots and honey eaters and a few distinctive groups really give you that vibe for Australian birds. And so I wanted to sort of cover that. And then in 2016, I spent a sabbatical helping a colleague out on his study of fairy wrens. And so I got to spend a couple of months in a patch of woodland and really get to know a lot of the Australian birds. And so I'll just show you a few of those natural history vignettes from that trip. So this started because this is a bit of a trick slide. This could have been taken at the UCSC Arboretum. So I work on sparrows at the UCSC Arboretum, and I suspect some of you birders have come down to the Arboretum to see the hummingbirds. And the interesting thing is the hummingbirds are at incredible densities. But the interesting thing is they're not feeding on plants that they have co-evolved with or that are native to North America. They feed on Australian plants. And so this is a grevillea. So this is a trick photo because it's a hummingbird photoshopped on top of a bird photographed in Australia at the plants that we would get in the Australian garden in the Arboretum. But this is what they would have, those flowers in Australia. They don't have hummingbirds there. They have these sparrow to crow-sized nectar-eating birds, the honey eaters. And so just it's a very, very different world. And I want to sort of give you a sense of that tonight. And as I said, I went on sabbatical to visit my colleague Raoul Mulder at University of Melbourne, and he played a role in making Australian birds pretty famous with his PhD work on this bird, the superb fairy wren. So Raoul has for 2 decades been working on the superb fairy wren, among other things. So this is where I went on my sabbatical down here in Melbourne, and I went to a little small sanctuary. It was actually a little patch of woods near a small town, but it was absolutely cram-packed with birds. Most of the photos I'm going to show you today were taken from that trip. They're my photos, and when I borrow photos from the internet, I will indicate that with if I can find the photographer with their name or just point out that it's not my photograph. And so it's always fun flying to international travel. And as I'm coming in and approaching Sydney, I realized the minute I get off the plane, it's going to be a different universe. It really is like traveling to a biological Mars. The birds are quite different. There's a currawong. They have very distinctive, their songs are different, their behaviors are often quite different. This is This is a nectar-eating bird the size of a crow. It's the red wattlebird, and these are all very common birds. Kookaburra. It's a kingfisher. It's a terrestrial kingfisher. And then Australian magpie. Listen to that musical. It's our crows and jays don't sound like that. This is the Australian magpie. We'll get to know it a little bit more a bit later on. The other thing is, so you see these just this weird array of birds, and literally every time I go to Australia, when I get off the plane, I sort of try to get over jet lag by going to a local park, and all I see are fighting birds. So here's a pair of magpies. I mean, I always get a whole array of nice photographs of fighting birds because everything seems to be fighting, very, very pugnacious. Noisy miners, or no, yes, these are noisy miners chasing a dove in a park. This is not my photograph, but basically this is what I saw on my most recent trip, something similar to this. Or chasing dogs. They were chasing me. I went to a local park and the noisy miners were chasing people and dogs. So very, very pugnacious, sort of in the way that hummingbirds are pugnacious to each other, and we'll return to that theme. So how do these birds get to be so unique and so weird? To get a handle on that, we need to think a little bit about biogeography. And Alfred Russel Wallace was the father of biogeography, and this is the study of the distributions of organisms. And the Earth's geological history, combined with evolution over time, explains some of the patterns of diversity we see across the globe. And based on Wallace, we now sort of have subdivided the world into unique zones or regions that each have their own distinct flora and fauna. And so if I were to blindfold the good naturalists among you and take you around the world and then set you free in a national park, you'd know exactly where you are based on the types of birds and plants and mammals that are there because they're unique. This is endemism. And we'll return to that because Australia is the grand champion of endemism or regionally specific groups of birds. And the reason for that it turns out this way is because of the Earth's geological history. Going back, some of you may have had this in the past, some may have heard about it, but not know the details. There used to be a single continent on planet Earth called Pangaea. Pangaea split into two continents, the northern continent of Laurasia, which became Eurasia and North America, and then a southern continent. And then as the world, and interestingly, there's a couple of tidbits here. Australia was down joined to Antarctica, and India was actually part of the south and migrated north and slammed into Eurasia. So there's fossil evidence. If you go to India, there's fossil evidence that links it back in geologic time to the southern continents. And over time, things became isolated. And when continents are isolated for long periods of time, their flora and fauna evolve to be distinct. And that's what's happened with Australia. And so these red numbers here, the 30 here, that's the number of bird families that are endemic to Australia. So, for example, there's only one family of birds. By family, I mean things like, the blackbirds are in the icterus. There's the blackbird family. We have the thrush family. We have the New World Warbler family. Those are all family level sorts of things. And we have one. Australia has 30 endemic families. That's extremely those families are only found in Australia and a huge number of them. And so that's what sort of makes Australia feel different, feel like Mars, is because of all this unique high level diversity that you get. And again, because this is a result of Australia being isolated from other continents for so long that the birds have evolved their own thing. And I'm going to play this video. Hopefully this will work. You may have to endure a little bit of ads because I'm linking to the internet and it might not show the video right away. But this is a video of a superb lyrebird singing. And what you'll hear, this is from Life of Birds, you'll hear the bird mimicking a lot of different things. And it's pretty spectacular. There we go.
What bird has the most elaborate, the most complex, the most beautiful song in the world? Well, I guess there are lots of contenders, but this bird must be one of them. The superb lyrebird of Southern Australia.
Sarita, you're getting sound from this? Okay, good.
He clears a space in the forest to serve as his concert platform. To persuade females to come close and admire his plumes, he sings the most complex song he can manage, and he does that by copying the songs of all the other birds he hears around him, such as the kookaburra. It's a very convincing impersonation. Even the original is fooled. He can imitate the calls of at least 20 different species. He also, in his attempt to outsing his rivals, incorporates other sounds that he hears in the forest. That was a camera shutter. And again. And now a camera with a motor drive. And that's a car alarm. And now the sounds of foresters and their chainsaws working nearby.
All right. So the point of that is that's a bird. The only way that that lyrebird would know those sounds is if it can learn them. And what innovation Australia gave to the world was birds that were able to learn their song. There's two, in terms of no other birds except the Aucian passerines, these sophisticated passerines are able to learn their songs, and they came out of Australia. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And they basically come from a crow-like stock of birds. And so if you're interested in the stuff I'm talking about today, a lot of it came from this book. It's a great book about just the natural history and evolution biology of Australian birds. It's Where Song Began by Tim Lowe, and there's just lots of really interesting sort of stories. And a very well-researched book to sort of talk about some of the things I'm talking about tonight. So I highly recommend it. Two flavors of birds. Aucian birds, things like thrashers, sparrows, those can learn their song. And then the sub-Aucians are things like flycatchers, and then some South American birds and a few African birds. In terms of these are songbirds, we're focusing on songbirds here. They cannot learn their songs. And the song learners came out of Australia. And what's also interesting is Australian songbirds are not what they appear to be. If you look at the names, we've got a wren, a fairy wren. We've got a creeper, a tree creeper. We've got a restless flycatcher. You can put all of those in quotation marks. And they were named this because they reminded Europeans of birds back home or birds in other parts of the world, a flycatcher, a creeper, a wren. But it turns out these are all derived from crow-type ancestors. And this was borne out. And so this is a family tree of the birds. And basically branches that are together are more closely related. And the farther back you go, the more ancestral the group. And so at the base of the tree are these sub-Aucians. These are songbirds that cannot learn their song. And then groups of birds that could learn to sing cropped up. And this includes things like the lyrebird, tree creeper, fairy wrens, honey eaters, all birds we're going to talk about. And then within a group called the Corvoidae, these are sort of even more crow-like in some ways, but monarch flycatchers, magpies, wood swallows, and then this oddball that looks exactly like a European robin, but it's not. It's in this group. And then we get the more advanced Aussian birds in the rest of the world. And so it's this distinct group of birds down here that really gives Australia its flavor to me, this sort of basal or at the base of the family tree of songbirds. And they're charming, interesting, and pretty unique. And I can't remember, I tried to remember where I got this from, but I couldn't remember. But basically, Gondwana, this is the southern continent before Africa, Australia, and South America parted ways due to continental drift. And we had a basal bird there that sort of went in different directions. Sub-Aussians, so this is if some of you know your South American birds, the ant birds and the oven birds and the flycatchers, those are all sub-Aussians. None of those learn their songs. There's some old world sub-Aussians, and then the Aussians in Australia, and they gave rise to the song-learning songbirds all over the world. And so I hadn't known that until I read Lowe's book. So, and all those interesting groups we talked about are kind of still in Australia today. So I'll just go through a couple of the families, and we'll just do a little sort of who's who. This is a splendid fairy wren. I actually took this on a different trip, but look at this bird. It's just remarkable. The colors are absolutely spectacular. And these are all common birds. So if you like interesting birds, colorful birds, interesting song, Australia is a great place because birds are in your face in Australia. It's a phenomenal place. Honey eaters, this is a group of some 60 species of birds that are all associated in one way or the other with nectar. So that's their hummingbird equivalent, I guess, in Australia. One of my favorite groups. We already saw the tree creeper. There's half a dozen species of these tree creepers. Interestingly, it's got a long back claw, just like our brown creeper. I was just teaching an ornithology lab, and the student said, wow, that brown creeper has a really long back nail. And I just realized this bird does as well. So being a creeper must require long toenails. Bowerbird, some of you are probably familiar from nature shows, the bowerbirds. Here's a great bowerbird, and this is not a nest. It's a structure to attract females for mating. Australian magpies, that delightful bird with a nice song, but we'll learn a little bit more about them. They're kind of, Australians have a love-hate relationship with this bird. Wood swallows, these are not swallows, but they look like swallows, but they're wood swallows. And so they, in terms what biologists refer to niches, and so there's kind of a swallow type niche, there's a wren type niche. So these Australian birds have filled niches that the birds we're more familiar with have also filled. So it seems like there's a swallow type niche for foraging, a creeper type niche, et cetera, wren type niche. Rufous whistler, which is a monarch flycatcher. It's not really a flycatcher, it's in that same group. And scarlet robin, again, these odd Australian robins that are their own thing. They look like lots of other robiny or flycatchery type birds around the world, and they're actually their own thing. Okay, now we'll just talk about a couple of groups of particular interest. Nectar everywhere. And so when I gave this talk to the Arboretum, I sort of one of the points for doing that was the Arboretum is very proud of all the hummingbirds they've got there. It's probably among one of the highest densities of hummingbirds in the world at the University of California, Santa Cruz Arboretum. And I think, I'm speculating here, but I think the reason for that incredible density is because there are Australian plants in the Arboretum. And Australian plants are adapted for nectar-eating birds that are 20 times, 30 times bigger than hummingbirds. And so the nectar production is incredible. So I like to think of Australia as a continent that's completely awash with nectar. And according to Tim Lowe, it's the only continent where the majority of trees are bird pollinated rather than wind pollinated. And so there are honey eaters absolutely everywhere. Here's a red wattlebird. It's called a wattlebird because it's got this little flange. There's another, and this is the size of a crow. which is kind of crazy. They're all spectacularly interesting. Here's a red wattlebird nest that was near my backyard when I was staying there. Beautiful, just for those of you interested in nests and eggs. Some of them are little. This is the size of, what would this be the size of? Maybe a golden crowned sparrow, a little bit bigger. This is a New Holland honeyeater. And these things are very social and also extremely feisty. If you've watched hummingbird feeders, you know hummingbirds fight over nectar. These guys fight over nectar too. And so I think some of the reason that Australian birds fight so much is partly they're fighting over very valuable resources. And they get together and do weird things. They haven't been that well studied. New Holland hummingbirds get together in big group chatters and have parties, and nobody is really clear what's going on here. They're called corroboree. And so here's a bunch of New Holland honeyeaters getting together and just having a party, for lack of a better word. And this was interesting. Yeah, this is interesting because this was sort of near my backyard, and this tree was packed full of birds, including these white-plumed honeyeaters. And like all other honeyeaters, they were very pugnacious. This restless flycatcher, I'll show you pictures a little bit later as well, but this restless flycatcher was trying to build a nest in this tree, and this gang of white-plumed honeyeaters were basically terrorizing anything that wanted to use their tree. I think the flycatchers persisted, but they were like nonstop fights all day by this bird, the honeyeater, attacking the flycatcher, just trying to chase it out of its area. And it's to the point where in some species, it gets so extreme that it has actually conservation and forestry implications. Here's a yellow tufted honeyeater, and it's eating a lerp. And a lerp is an insect that feeds on eucalyptus, and there's so much sugar in the system that these lerps produce basically like a cotton candy exudate that the birds like to eat. So here's the lerp, and that's all like sugar that the insect is exuding. And that's like having a hummingbird feeder on the whole tree. And so the honeyeaters are very defensive of entire trees and sometimes entire forests to defend these lerps. And so here's a lerp. So this is crystallized honeydew. That's like cotton candy, and there's the insect. And it turns out that these honeyeaters are actually farming the system. They're chasing away all other birds so that nobody else eats this food so that the honeyeaters can have it all to themselves. The problem is these are herbivores that chew up the plants. And if nobody's eating these insects, it can actually be bad for the forests. And so there's a couple of cases, like bell miners are among the most extreme in terms of aggressive honeyeaters. And they'll kill other birds and basically clean out an entire area. People have done studies, and where there's bell miners, there are not other species of birds, small songbirds. They've just chased them all away, and in some cases actually kill them. So here's one that they'll chase and kill if they can get, the spotted pardalot. This is a gorgeous little bird. And the study found that they get excluded completely from bell miner territories. And just as a tangent, these guys are pretty interesting on their own right. Here's one singing this really loud song and putting all of its heart and soul into its song right above me. I was eating my lunch and I heard this funny noise and looked up, and here was this pardalot singing. And you can see its whole throat is all puffed out in its song. Kind of a cool little bird. And this is called bell miner associated dieback. This is forest that is thought to die back because the bell miners have chased all of the birds away, and the insects take off and basically explode and consume the forest. I think that story has been debunked. There's a literature on that. It's unclear whether that's entirely true at this level, but certainly there are impacts that these bell miners are having effects at the entire community in terms of what birds are there, and perhaps even the health of the trees somewhat, just because they are so aggressive, which is pretty phenomenal. We don't have anything similar to that in North America, as far as I can remember. And this actually raises conservation implications. This is a good friend of mine, Michael McGraw, he works at the Melbourne Zoo, and they're conserving endangered birds. And this is the helmeted honeyeater, a local subspecies of the yellow tufted honeyeater. There's only 200 of those left. And so they're frantically trying to preserve these birds. And to do that, they have to remove miners, noisy miners and bell miners, because they will kill these and get rid of them. So they have to protect these endangered species by getting rid of the more aggressive honey eaters like the noisy miner. And so this pugnacious behavior actually has consequences for other birds and conservation biology as well. So you can see papers like this, stop the bullying in the corridors. Basically people are trying to find ways to keep noisy miners out of their gardens so they can have more birds. And so there's papers in the Australian literature about how to deal with this aggressive bully species. All right, the second big group that really stands out that you see everywhere in a way that you don't in other places is parrots. And it's in part because they're garden birds. People put out bird feeders in their backyard and they get parrots rather than other things. You can have like 5 species of parrots coming to the feeder in your backyard. And so they're big, they're colorful, and they're very common. And in some cases, they're actually seen as agricultural pests. And a lot of these we know from the pet trade because people keep sulfur-crested cockatoos as pets. So these are basically farmland birds, like we would see starlings or other common sort of farmland birds around here. And they adapt to people incredibly well. These are wild cockatoos, but they'll have parks where people like to feed the parrots, and they'll just come down and cover people and hang around because they like to get fed. And in some places, they actually feed them reasonable food rather than junk food, but still they're changing their behavior. And then you can get close. So here's a sulfur-crested cockatoo party where they're all showing off their party hats. Look at those gorgeous crests of these cockatoos. A couple of other parrots. These are galahs, a type of parrot. Australians, for some reason, think these are kind of goofy birds. So to call someone a galah is basically akin to calling someone an idiot, because these guys, and I've watched these guys, they're very playful and kind of silly seeming. So I guess I understand where the name came from, but they're absolutely gorgeous birds. Nice colors of gray, pink, and here you have gray, pink, and paler pink. Gorgeous, and common. Here's a galah doing a nice stretch. Here's one playing on a wire. It was windy one day, and I went outside. I could hear all this noise. They were just playing. They were going round and round in the wings. So they were grabbing onto the wires, the guy wires on this tower, and just spinning around in the wind. And clearly a playful, very playful bird. Lots of other things. I think there's something like, again, like the honey eaters, probably 60 species of parrots. Eastern rosella. This is a long-billed corella. That's a pretty weird bill. I don't know what they eat, but it must be something interesting to have such a bizarre shaped beak. And then there's some flower eating. There's a group of parrots, lorikeets, that are nectar eaters. And so you can find them around the eucalyptus. And here's a musk lorikeet eating out of some eucalyptus flowers. And then rainbow lorikeets. So you can go to parks that feed these guys, and you can have 20 or 30 rainbow lorikeets land on you, and it's a pretty spectacular looking bird. And again, these are common birds in cities, people's backyards. They'll come into your feeders if you feed them nectar, or depending on the species. Very easy to see and fun to watch. I've forgotten. I hadn't actually gone through the whole cycle. I forgot that I embedded sounds. I was walking in the woods and I heard this incredible noise, and it was a parrot fight. And what was happening was this sulfur-crested cockatoo was trying to evict this long-billed corella out of its nest. These are cavity nesting birds, and sometimes nest cavities can be limiting. And so there's a nice body of literature that suggests that one reason why parrots, both male and female parrots, might be colorful or have crests or just basically have this ornamentation is because they use it in competition for nest cavities. And I don't know if that's what was going on here, but clearly the cockatoo was trying to rip the corellas out of the nest, but in the end, the corellas won. And so the cockatoos were unsuccessful. I think it was the corellas' nest in the first place, but that was a fun behavior to watch. I think this corella is celebrating that it's still got its nest. Looks very happy. All right. Now the sort of the last part of the talk is I'll talk specifically about birds at this one place that I got to spend a couple of months at near Melbourne. It's a small sort of nature preserve, and it's where my colleague Raul had a study of fairy wrens. And so I got to live in a field house and just basically go and help him with this project and just enjoy seeing Australian birds every day. And of course, mammals as well. Why is it? Excuse me. Okay. Mammals as well. So of course, instead of deer, the deer we get here, you get kangaroos. It's basically they're common and everywhere, just like deer are here. This is our field house. Unfortunately, it's no longer available. It was condemned, and so my friend had to end his project. So I'm glad I went there when I did. It's a comfortable place to be based when watching Australian birds. And just a little bit about my colleague's project. This is a superb fairy wren, and that's what we were there to study. Habitat looks like this. Open sort of eucalyptus woodland. Again, kangaroos. Typical sort of Australian birds, lots of kangaroos, big birds, emus around. I'm used to seeing these on emu farms, so it's odd to see them as a wild bird roaming around, but they were sort of in our backyard. So one group I want to talk about, and then we'll end with a few other species, but cooperative breeding is pretty widespread in Australia. And this happens when you get more than 2 adults at a nest. They reproductively mature, even though they may not all be breeding. In some cases, there might only be a male and a female that are actually having the kids, and then often the helpers might be grown adult offspring from the past. And Australia is famous for this cooperative breeding. You guys know some cooperative breeders. You may not realize that's what they're called, but in California, this is our famous cooperative breeder. Acorn woodpeckers, same deal. They live in family groups. They have helpers, but in acorn woodpeckers, you can often get 2 females breeding in a cavity and more than 1 male having chicks sired in the brood. And so the cooperative system of acorn woodpeckers is fairly complex. But one important point is we only have 2 or 3 in California, 2 or 3 cooperative breeding birds. Australia is full of them. It's the norm in Australia. So that's a really big difference between the biology of their birds and our birds. And so just to give you a sense, so if you look at where cooperative breeding is found around the world, I think it's something like about maybe 6% of all birds in the world are cooperative breeders. No, 6% of songbirds, I think it is, are cooperative. But in Australia, 30% of the songbirds have this cooperative breeding system. So it's the norm rather than the exception. And one of the reasons for that is that early slide I showed of all of the different sort of crow-type birds that Australia sort of produced. Cooperative breeding is part of their biology, and when those birds have gone to other continents, the cooperative breeding goes with them. And so there's, for some reason, that basal group of songbirds that are very crow-like, and some of those other ones, cooperative breeding is very prominent in that group of birds. So Raul was studying the cooperative breeding in fairy wrens, and so here's a breeding male. This might be his female. This might be a female from last year, a yearling, and this is a young male. You can tell yearlings will not put on the full color. And so this might be a cooperative family group of fairy wrens. And so Raul spent a lot of time sort of looking at the biology of cooperative breeding. Here's a male and a female on a branch outside my house. Very, very fantastic birds. And it's a color banded sort of project. So you go around with your binoculars trying to see individual birds and finding out who's hanging out with who and get a sense for whether young are still with their parents or trying to seek a territory on their own. And one interesting thing is males, an interesting feature of this study is that most of the babies in a nest are not sired by the male who's tending that nest. They're sired by neighbors. I think it's something like 80% of the chicks. The infidelity rate is about 80%. And here we have a couple of males courting a female. These are males that were not associated with her group, but they've come over to her territory and they're visiting and they're showing off and trying to appear really sexy, and they're trying to obtain surreptitious matings with her and obtain sire some babies in her own nest. And so that's quite an interesting behavior that these birds do. Oh, and here's how they do it. They often, what's interesting is, here's a fairy wren. I didn't take this picture. I've seen this a couple of times. When fairy wrens go courting other females, they'll bring flowers. This is a yellow petal, and they have this yellow petal display. And so when they're trying to impress a neighboring female, they bring flowers, but they don't do this display to their own female. So kind of an interesting twist. Here's a fairy wren nest. They're little dome nests with feathers, and they can be kind of tricky to find because they hide them very well. And one bird that's very good at finding fairy wren nests is the horsefeld's bronze cuckoo. It's a small species of cuckoo, but it's one of its favorite hosts is the fairy wren. And here's an example. Here's a nest we found that had a cuckoo egg. You can see it's a little bit different. It's more oval shaped, and the fairy wren eggs are less speckled and more round. So this is clearly a cuckoo nest. And the horsefeld's is a specialist on fairy wrens. We also had shining bronze cuckoos, but they parasitize different species. And that's quite an attractive cuckoo, I think. They're very small. They're about 6 inches long. This species parasitizes yellow rump thornbills. And a colleague of Raoul Mulder's has actually been studying the brood parasitism in this species, and she and her colleagues have found, Naomi Langmore is her name, and she found some very interesting things. This is a thornbill baby, and on the lower right is a fairy wren. They're different colors. The fairy wren baby is a pink baby. The yellow rump thornbill is a yellow baby, and the cuckoo species that specialize in parasitizing them have matched the babies. So the horsefeld bronze cuckoo, which is a fairy wren parasite, matches the color of the baby. And we now know that the reason they do that is the host can sometimes recognize the parasitic chick and will toss it out of the nest. So this is a form of chick mimicry by the brood parasite to reduce the chances that the host will recognize that the baby is not a fairy wren and will toss it out of the nest. Here's another cooperative breeder. This is the Australian magpie. They live in small groups, but it's not their cooperative breeding. So here's like groups of 3 or 4. They've also been studied from a cooperative breeding perspective. But what makes them fun is they are hyper aggressive and territorial, both towards other magpies, but also other species like people. And they have very sharp beaks, and they are very aggressive, and they are famous throughout Australia. And every year in spring, the newspapers get full of newspaper articles saying it's magpie season. And it's magpie season because these birds will aggressively chase people, knock them off their bike, they poke them. And so, and it's at almost at epidemic levels. And so you can find websites that basically they call them swooping. It's swooping season, and they'll tally the number of reported cases of swooping. I want you to look at this x-axis. That's 2,000. In Queensland, there were 2,000 reports to this online site of people being attacked by magpies. And so here's a cyclist getting attacked by a magpie. But the Australians actually like them. They can sometimes get injured, but they kind of like these birds because they sort of Australian spirit. They stand up for themselves. So here's just, you can also go online and find its magpie swoop reports for one season, and they plot them. Yellow is a swoop. Red is it actually injured the person that was being swooped. So this gives you a sense for where you don't want to live. You don't want to get attacked by magpies in Australia. Basically, stay away from the East Coast. So that's why magpies are famous for that. And there's been studies to sort of try and get at this. And one study found that magpies don't hate all of humanity, they just hate particular people. And so, for example, one magpie that was studied just hated this little kid, this boy. And on the way to school, they would attack this little boy and they wouldn't attack anybody else. So they get a bee in their bonnet and decide that they don't like people and go after them. This might be one of my top 10 favorite birds in the world. It's another cooperative breeder. It's in that sort of crow-type radiation. They're called white-winged choughs. You know, there's choughs in Europe. These are not related to those choughs, but they're named similar as a type of a crow-type bird. Notice that red, bulging red eyeball. And one study that I read claims that these birds are cooperative because the babies are really stupid, and it takes them many years to get good at foraging, which is hard to believe because how they forage is they look under leaves and scrape the leaf litter, but apparently it takes them many years to become good at foraging. And so one of the reasons they have groups is to basically the kids, it takes them a long time to be adept at getting food. And so you get a large number of birds at nests. This is called a Google eye display. The birds can puff up their eyes with blood, and it's a excited display, and they get in groups and they all puff up their eyeballs, and it means they're very excited. And I read about this in the literature, and then I had a fun encounter with this. These birds will attack each other. The territories are well defended, and birds from one territory will go in and try and steal babies from their neighbors, or will nail or wreck their neighbors' nests to try and take over their territory. And so one day I was walking near my house and I saw this massive group of white-winged choughs just screaming their heads off, and there was another group screaming their head off, and they were clearly having some kind of big, huge fight. And I know that they wreck each other's nests, and so I checked under the nest that was nearby later, and I found that, in fact, there had been an egg chucked out of the nest. So that big fight that was going on was because the neighboring group had come in and chucked one of the eggs out in one of these sort of territorial battles. But really, really interesting bird. And I've always wanted to photograph them at the nest. So after many years of not doing much tree climbing practice, I just about killed myself getting up this large and very smooth barked eucalyptus tree because I wanted to be adjacent to this chough nest, because I knew from previous trips to Australia that once you're up in the tree, the choughs will treat you like you're like a monkey or something. There's no monkeys in Australia, but they'll just treat you like you're a tree branch. And so that nest is really only about 15 feet away because I took this with my cell phone. And then I was rewarded with this incredible several hours just watching these birds go to their nest. They were building this giant mud bowl of a nest, and all very excited and just basically ignoring me. So it was a very magical moment. And as you can see, just a very charismatic bird. And now just to finally wrap up for a few more minutes, this is sort of a fun little wetland that was packed, woods around it that was absolutely packed with birds. I would go and hang out there, and there were like lots of nests and territorial interactions. And so I'll just give you a sense for just a few of the things that were going on in this very small patch of wetland. This is a willy wagtail. You got to hand it to the Australians. Willy wagtail, that's a great name. And so willy wagtails do wag their tail. They're fly-catching type birds, and they're always wagging their tail. They're very fun to watch, but they also have incredible nests. And here was a wagtail nesting at eye level. It's totally covered with spider web. It was bringing in spider web and rubbing it on the nest to make this almost hummingbird type nest. So here you can see it's rubbing the spider web all over that just gorgeous little nest, a really beautiful little nest. And it was low enough that I could actually take a picture with my cell phone looking down into the nest. So I think that's quite a beautiful construction. Willy wagtail. They're also very aggressive. This is a kookaburra that came too close to that nest that was being built, and willy wagtail was not happy about that because kookaburras are nest predators. They eat lizards, snakes, and baby birds, and so that willy wagtail was telling that kingfisher to go, that kookaburra to go somewhere else for breakfast. Here's the restless flycatchers. They were also there. That they eventually put a nest. You can just see a little bit of nest material. They were sort of like, it took them about 2 weeks to build a nest because these are the guys that had that really obnoxious neighbor, the white-plumed honeyeater. And so here's the restless flycatcher just trying to get nesting material to take back to its nest, and the protesting white-plumed honey eater just basically chasing it nonstop. So that was good bird soap opera, good value for a couple of weeks. This is a cool bird. It's a striped tit, and it's got that really strong beak. And that beak is interesting because they're filling a niche that is empty in Australia. Australia does not have woodpeckers. It's the only continent that never got woodpeckers. And these guys are sort of filling that niche because they get and they rip big chunks of bark. That beak is really big because they're ripping up chunks of bark to get under the bark for insects. Oops, eastern striped tit. And here you can see it's just like, I was watching this guy, just like ripping off big chunks of bark to get at insects under the bark. So this is filling an empty woodpecker type niche a little bit. It doesn't peck, but it can get under the bark to get at insects. Eastern yellow robin. At first I wondered, like, why would I show you this robin? It's kind of okay, it's not spectacular. What was spectacular about it was its crazy nest. It built this volcano type nest and decorated it all with bark. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm interested in the evolution of nest architecture, and we just don't have really nests that look like that in North America. So who knows why it did that, just to have a fancy looking home, or maybe it serves some purpose, but it certainly doesn't look that camouflage to me. All right, the last bird of the slideshow. This is a tawny frogmouth. It's related to porwills and nightjars and nighthawks, but it's about the size of a long-eared owl, perhaps, maybe between a long-eared owl and a great horned owl. They are very large birds. They're common, but they're hard to see because they imitate sticks so much. And they make almost a skimpy little nest, like a mourning dove or something, and then they sit on it looking like a twig. And so if you're lucky, you can come across them. But whenever they if you get too close to them, they're trying to look like a twig. But if they're relaxed, they look like owls. And so this is that dinky nest, just like mourning doves. Sometimes nests fall down, and so some students working on the project came back really excited and said there was a tawny frogmouth with its baby on the fence near the house. And so I set my camera up at about 20 yards, and I was far enough away from the birds that they looked more like owls than nightjars. And then I started my camera on video automatically and started walking towards the birds. And what the last image is going to show is these birds going from this to doing their stick imitation. And so here they are. Unfortunately, they'd already started to look a little bit like sticks, and I'm walking towards them. Even the baby's got it down pat. It's like, on a stick, on a stick. I think that's lovely. That would be the end of our journey. I'd worried that I had too many slides, so I cut some out, but I think that's okay to not go on.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce. I loved seeing your photos, getting a glimpse of the diversity of birds out there and how odd they are. It was great. I loved it. Thank you so much for that. So we do have a few questions in the chat already, so I do want to get right to those. So speaking of diversity of birds, so one question from Orr is, I'm a little familiar with how some passerines in North America speciated recently, glaciation pushing them south into separate population refuges. How did so many species within each family evolve in a relatively small landmass like Australia?
That's a great question, and what the question is pointing to is most evolutionary biologists believe that what's called allopatric or separate geographic ranges are required for diversification. And so mountain ranges are separation over distance. And so that's a good question. And I don't know what that would have been, but climate change over the past, and these are very, very old. Don't forget, this is a ancient group of birds. The passerines you're talking about, that's in the last million years or even 500,000 years. We're talking millions and millions of years. So there's just been a lot more time. But at different times, climate change can fragment forest patches. So I don't know the geology and the botany of Australia going back in time, but I would bet that climate cycles probably ended up with sort of scattered habitat and separation. But you're absolutely right that the idea is that you need some kind of separating barrier. At least that's our current thinking. So that's an excellent question.
Yeah, another question from Or was, earlier you talked about learned versus innate songs. Do you happen to know if New Zealand wrens can learn their songs?
I think they're suboscines. I believe it's a really weird group, and I don't pay much attention to it in my ornithology class because it's like a small monotypic family. But I think it's a suboscine. And I should point out there's evidence for one species of suboscine that can learn its song. I'm not sure how convincing it is, but there was like this major discovery. It's like, wait a sec, bellbirds in Central America might be able to learn their song.
Interesting.
So never say never.
Yeah. And then we had a few comments, questions about cooperative breeding. So one of them from Meredith, do you know if crows are cooperative breeders?
Yes. Many crows are cooperative breeders. And in fact, it's not just the crows, but not all crows are, but I think it occurs in some common crows. Ravens, I don't think are cooperative breeders, but the jays, cooperative breeding is rampant in the jays. Mexican jays is a cooperative breeder. Gray jay is a cooperative breeder. Scrub jays are famous for their cooperative breeding. There's been long-term studies, and so jays, unlike crows, but and all through South America, magpie jays. So yes, in that group of corvids, cooperative breeding is very, very common, and it's thought that that's because they come from the corvid stock. There's nothing other than that. I mean, people can't find environmental predictors. It's just like your ancestors pass that trait on to you. It's probably adaptive in some ways, but it somehow goes with being a corvid or jay type bird. So that's a great question.
Yeah. I also just wanted to share that Ellie shared that there's also a correlation with cuckoo species abundance and cooperative breeders, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I actually reviewed that paper.
Oh.
And Raoul Mulder, the person I talked about, is an author on that paper. So the guy who was hosting me was actually one of the authors that did that study. It's actually a very nice study. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Awesome. Okay, and then Doug asked, did the extreme fires seriously decimate any bird types in Australia?
I have no idea, but there are a bunch of endangered birds in Australia. The parrots, a bunch of parrots are not that common. Some honey eaters, but it's actually the mammals. I would worry about the mammals. My colleague Michael McGraw also works with mammals, and the marsupials. The birds are doing much better than the mammals in Australia. The invasive introduced things like foxes, stoats, and things have really wreaked havoc with the marsupials. So I would actually be more concerned about them in the fires, given where things are with mammals versus birds in Australia. But the bottom line is I don't know.
Okay, and then another question from Dean. If a mother bird can recognize colors in babies, why do they keep feeding the cuckoo when it doesn't look like hers?
That's a complicated question that would take a whole seminar. I've studied this, and I know the literature. It depends on what information they have, and these cuckoos are an unusual case. Most cuckoos don't recognize chicks. They're happy to feed them. And the reason that these birds recognize chicks is a bit unclear. And it's possibly that there might be some birds, it varies among individual host females. So the thing is, it might be that some can recognize and some cannot. It's unclear, but it's a good question. But yeah, and a lot of these defenses are never perfect. Otherwise, the cuckoo would be extinct. If it can't find a host to raise its baby, but it does raise the question, like if it can tell sometimes, and interestingly, what we're looking at with the color is the cuckoo now evolved to look like the other chick, and so now the reason it feeds it is maybe because it mimics the skin color, and so if that's what the parents are using, so it's solved the problem, and it may be that's how early on they could tell the difference. And once it mimics it, there may not be other useful information it can tell. So it's like an arms race where the cuckoo kind of cracked the arms race and won.
Very interesting. And then another question from Ivan. There seem to be a lot of Australian trees with really peeling bark. Is the bird you showed the only one that excavates under the bark to feed?
I think so. I think that's the only one that really can rip up the bark. Creepers might poke around if it's pulled up, but what the shrike is doing is actually ripping chunks off. I mean, it's like really ripping with strength. It's got big feet and things. So it's, as far as I know, it's the only one that's getting like really pulling the bark off the tree to get under it.
Very cool. And then Yvonne also did, oh, actually Ellie says yellow-tailed black cockatoos do that too. Thanks for sharing that.
Do they? They rip off the bark because yeah, I guess that would make sense. Yes, they can rip whatever they want. Their beaks are so strong. I've watched them ripping up cones, Banksia cones, but I haven't actually seen them ripping up bark, but I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, she says to gain access to grubs.
Okay. Thank you for that correction.
Yeah. And then let's see, there was also a request to play that tawny frogmouth video again, if you don't mind doing that.
Okay, sure. This is posted on YouTube too. I have a YouTube channel and I put a few things like this up, and I think it's on the YouTube channel. So cute.
Okay, and then let's see. I think other than that, I saw a lot of interesting comments, which I'll be sure to share with you. In the meanwhile, I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and also to Bruce for this incredible talk, of course, and sharing all those wonderful photos and videos. Is there anything else that you want to share with everybody before we end up signing off?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Go to Australia. It's amazing. It's easy to travel around. It's English speaking. The people are very friendly and fun, and it's so exotic. It really is. It's a mind bender. And for me, what I like, I'm an ecologist, evolutionary biologist, so I can really appreciate just how different it is. When I've been studying birds in the northern hemisphere for like 40 years, and so when you go somewhere where everything's different, it's really like you've been kidnapped and put into a Mars.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so everybody, it's easy for other people to get that same, to go and just really revel in the coolness that is Australia.
Yeah, if you have any particular recommendations on locations to bird, there was someone who asked.
I'm not enough of a birder. I mean, it's just, you can go online, eBird, but it's just like lots and lots of places. Queensland is very good. Perth is fantastic. So Queensland has tropical rainforests, and just basically, and from Queensland down to Sydney, there's all sorts of great national parks. You can rent a caravan. You can rent what they call they have caravan parks, and you can just rent a little, like a VW camper van, and just go around the country. There's something, it's on my bucket list to do that, to spend a month in Australia driving around in a camper van.
That sounds amazing. And then one last question I saw here was, what was that bird that looked like the European robin?
It's just a red. It's a robin. Was a red-chested, red-breasted robin, or something like that. Someone said they thought it looked like a vireo.
Yeah. I think you said like scarlet robin, and
yes, it could be scarlet robin.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
There's a bunch of robins. There's a pink robin. There's like probably 6 to 8 species of robins.
And completely different from what we call a robin here.
They're basically crow robins. Call them crow robins.
Once again, thank you so much, Bruce. That was amazing. And I know lots of people are like inspired to go to Australia and want to see those birds for themselves, including myself. So once again, thank you. All right.
We could do this again next year on a different topic.
Yes, please do. We love like to welcome you back.
Argentina. I should eventually have a pretty good talk on Argentina.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. All right. Thank you again so much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and please do join us for a future event, and hopefully we'll have more of these available for next year. So we'll see you then.
Thanks, everybody.